Good morning. Welcome to another Saturday morning at the Climate and Energy Forum on Bainbridge Island. A whole bunch of groups on this island who all work on climate change thought it would be more effective to work together because we all recognized that we needed a broader community conversation so that people could recognize the issues around climate change and energy. These are the whole host of reasons that people in this group are interested in having these conversations, and the breadth of things we will be talking about over the course of the next year. Although that said, we've actually already come up with almost 2 years worth of topics that we want to cover with the community. The real sort of impetus driver is the big scale change that we need to have happen. How do we move from being a community that largely gets our power from coal-based electric generation to being a community that is relying on renewable energy and is part of the movement forward into the future rather than continuing to propagate the failed technologies of the past. Awareness, relevance, and action. Those are the three things that we want everyone to get out of this. Really, the action is the part we want to make sure happens. And we have a program that's lined out over the next year for all of you. The next meeting will actually be, we're going to take December off. You get a little holiday. And then in January, we're going to do January and February both, we're going to do Wednesday evenings. So it'll be a little bit different. But we didn't want to conflict with other things that were going on those Saturdays. We felt like there's a lot going on in this community. We wanted to be respectful of the other things people were doing. And we also wanted to give a go at, can we get a different suite of people if we do it on a weeknight instead of a weekend morning? And then we'll be back in March to Saturdays. Topics we have coming up are climate justice, gas as a bridge fuel, ? The electric grid demystified. One of the conversations I had many times with my friends and neighbors was, how does the grid really work? Aren't we getting dirty electrons? I don't want the dirty electrons. Can I filter those out? So we're going to talk about how the grid works. We're going to talk about carbon fee and dividend, and there'll be a lot of talks about renewable energy. A couple of quick items. For those of you who were here last week, there were a lot of people who wanted copies of the Bainbridge Island Climate Impact Assessment. EcoAdapt does not have a grant to print copies for everyone, but there are flyers out in the front with the URL of where you can find it and read it online or print it yourself. There are also flyers out there about the next 2 events that we have coming up. We'll talk more about those at the end. And then finally, up at the front, there is a stack of these, which are temporary taxi gills. You could get 2 of these, take them home, a great way to talk to your friends and neighbors about the fact that we live on an island and we are all vulnerable to climate change. So, without further ado, I will turn this over to my friend and colleague Steve Johnson, who will take you through the tour of what I like to refer to as the electronification of Bainbridge Island.
Well, good morning, everybody. How do you hear me?
Good.
Hear me good? Okay, great. Well, I think this is an exciting topic. I see in the news today the announcement, and some of you may have seen it, of Tesla's 500-mile heavy-duty road truck, all electric. And another great development led by Tesla. I'm sure there's a lot of hiccups in terms of when we'll actually see these on the road, but 500 miles is pretty good range. And another aspect of how this sector, the transportation sector, can really help us go after the problem of climate change. I won't go in, this audience I'm sure knows and has a scientific orientation to facts and understands the problem of climate change. So let me go beyond that, but I want to talk for a minute about kind of pessimism and even despair. You know, after the last presidential election and so forth, you know, I was pretty bummed about where we're going and deal with this problem. Withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords, not a good thing. And so I think we're going to have a good news story for you on ways in which that are independent of the Trump administration. California and other states are doing great things on their own. And we'll talk about what we can do with transportation that the federal government doesn't have too much control over, and we make progress there. So here we are, you know, climate conference. This is actually about a 20-year-old cartoon, if you believe that. The picture's pretty bleak, gentlemen. The world's climates are changing, the mammals are taking over, and we have a brain about the size of a walnut. So I don't know the size of our collective brain, and I misspoke too. This is the 5th extinction that's illustrated there. We're in the 6th extinction, right? So on this kind of pessimism area and where that can be a problem we ought to address. 10 years ago, I was at some kind of climate conference in Phoenix, and I happened to go on a morning hike with the CEO of the Bonneville Power Administration. Now, Bonneville, huge agency, billion-dollar agency. It runs the dams on the Columbia River, an atomic generating plant, nuclear generating plant, a lot of renewables and solar as well. And it's 97% clean energy coming from that agency, also runs the transmission around there. So, very important person. And we were talking about the presentations, and he said, well, reality is, he said, I don't think much can be done. I think that it's too late to go after climate change from what I know. And it was sort of counter to what he'd been saying in the meeting. But this is the honesty on the hike. And I was sort of shattered. This person who worked for a nonprofit agency, provided clean power, and I said to him, you have tremendous leverage and influence. And but as it happened at the time, I was reading Barack Obama's book, The Audacity of Hope. And a component of that is Obama's statement that leadership's about hope. And of course, despair is directionless. You know, where if you took Steve Wright's, this guy's name, if you took his counsel, you know, what would you do the next day? Get up and what? And so this topic, I think, is an opportunity to look some good news, some stuff that's right in front of us that can be done about climate change, and I hope we'll all help influence the advancement of. So let's get to some of the data. I'm going to just do a little bit of data and then turn to the presenters. We've got some great presenters who are going to talk about the substance of this issue. So here's the sectors of the economy that are contributing greenhouse gases. And you can see the generation of electricity. Most of the country, it's still coal and natural gas. Industry itself is burning stuff to generating carbon dioxide. Residential and commercial, people heating their homes with natural gas and so forth. And then agriculture is a big producer in various ways, including cows and that kind of thing. So there it is. And then back to electricity, we hope to see it, and we're seeing a trend where transportation is going to be very much impacted with and has a big relationship with electricity, because that's going to be our new fuel, right? And already is. So let's talk about the greenhouse gas inventory for Washington State. So this is the similar picture, but for Washington State. And here you can see that transportation is a much bigger segment. Almost half of the carbon dioxide produced in Washington State comes from vehicles. So what's going on here? One of the reasons for that is the electric sector is not as big a contributor to carbon, and so it's 16.52%. This includes resources used by utilities in the state, but they're out of state, so kind of coal by wire. But it's mostly in-state natural gas turbines, plus the Colstrip coal plant. But the reason it's that low number is we are a hydro state. We've got the benefits of the Columbia River, and that's a very good thing, reducing that number and raising the transportation number. This is consumption-based residential and commercial. This is houses and that kind of thing. We've got industrial processes and waste management, burning waste or wastes contributing other way to the bad stuff in the atmosphere. So what is the greenhouse gas inventory for Washington State's transportation sector? Well, look at this on transportation. We've got 21% is on-road gasoline. Actually, that's not 21%. That's the tons of carbon, right, Randall? Randall Samstag guy did these slides for me, and I got to refer to him. So, but in fact, in proportions, it's about half. It's 50%. Then you add diesel fuel. So now you're getting a huge chunk of the carbon produced in this state because of the other benefits we have from carbon-free generation of electricity and so on. Jet fuel, that's a tough one. That could be a program. We don't have people in there. There's some interesting things happen on there, but I see this as on the far horizon of what we're going to be able to deal with. This stuff is right here, and we're going to hear about it and what we can deal with it, how we can deal with it. So then let's go on to talk about who our speakers are. So I think I'll go through all of these folks who have very kindly traveled, some from long distances, to help us address this issue. First, we have John Clausen. John is the Executive Director of Kitsap Transit. He's one of their oldest employees. He started out in the 1980s as a bus driver when the agency was being established. He's got a distinguished career of service outside of Kitsap Transit. He was for 30 years on the city council of the city of Port Orchard. He's had some business ventures and so on, so he's a very interesting guy. And I'm pleased to say the day I called him about this program, he said, in front of me is a contract I'm signing for an all-electric ferry. So he'll tell you about that. So it's on order, and we're going to hear a little bit more about it. So Bill Moyer, who I just saw come in, had to come all the way from Vashon Island. Bill is the Executive Director of the Backbone Campaign. The Backbone Campaign is a campaign of a progressive movement building group-based activities and innovative efforts around artful activism. So remember the kayaktivists and the Global Horizon and Shell Know that campaign? Bill organized that. He and his organization, the Backbone Campaign, and they've done other efforts like that around the country. So a really interesting guy, and he's got a publication that he was a co-author of called Solutionary Rail. I think you're going to find it really interesting. Then we have Matt Von Rudden, who lives right here on Bainbridge Island. He's the Director of Vessel Engineering for Washington State Ferries. He's going to talk to us generally about what the Washington State Ferry System is doing on battling climate change versus primarily with ideas around electrification of the fleet, but in particular about a project potentially to electrify the ferries that serve Bainbridge Island, the current ferries, and make them into, he'll explain it to us, a hybrid type system. Finally, we have Randall Samstag, many of you know. Randall's going to cover electric vehicles and kind of tie this up, what we can get out of this in terms of impacting the climate and so forth. Randall has a bachelor's degree from Stanford, two master's degree in engineering from University of California, Berkeley. So with that, why don't we start with you, John Clausen? Welcome.
Thank you. I'll give the hand mic a try, and thank you very much. And I'm excited to be here this morning. And you know, I've got to tell a little bit of a bad thing on my part. I own a Chevrolet Volt, and I bought it back in 2013. In 2013.
They had electric cars in.
Yeah, they did, but they're probably not working today. Anyway, and I've been using my Volt, and I was sharing earlier that the only problem I have with my Volt is the trip computer. It tells you what kind of miles per gallon you're getting, but it stops at 250 miles per gallon and just puts a little plus sign. So all that I can say is I'm getting over 250 miles per gallon with my Chevy Volt. Now, the thing that I have to tell on myself is I didn't drive it today. I drove my tank. And the reason I didn't is my daughter-in-law was driving my car and got into an accident. So my Volt is in the body shop. So anyway, I'm excited about the future of transportation, and I'll just give you a couple real quick facts. I was looking at some numbers a little while ago. And the public transportation industry in the United States, we have something like 140-some thousand buses that we operate in the U.S. And we drive on an annual basis, or at least in 2014, just shy of about 3.5 billion miles. So you can see what our contribution is to these slides that you just saw a few minutes ago. Now, bring it down to us. We have total about 150 vehicles. Now, that's everything from staff vehicles to the buses. And we drive on the service, the bus service that we provide to the community, right around 750,000 miles a year. So we certainly do our part in contributing to this problem that we're all facing with the carbon problems and other pollutions. From an industry standpoint, though, our industry has been struggling for a number of years to try to come up with what's the alternative for us. You know, we're driving these great big heavy vehicles. It takes a big heavy diesel engine to push them down the road. But there's got to be some alternatives. And to be honest with you, an awful lot of it up to this point has been, we need cleaner air. What are we going to do? And our industry has been looking at a variety of things from compressed natural gas to fuel cells. And probably within the last, probably the last, 8 years, there's been some effort in electric buses. And the momentum on electric buses, now this is not the electric trolleys that have been around for years and years and years. These are just battery electric buses. The momentum on that technology in our industry has been increasing 3-4-fold in the last, I would say, in the last 3 years. There's a lot of effort going into the development of battery electric buses, similar to the EVs that we're all used to. It's probably about the same time when Volts came out in 13. Of course, Priuses were out before that. But there's a number of manufacturers now in our industry. Number means like 4 or 5. But this is one company. BYD is actually a company that is owned and runs in China. They're starting to show up here in the U.S., and they've got a plant down in California now. But they've been doing a lot of battery vehicles in China for a while now. New Flyer is another bus manufacturer here in the U.S. They have been spending an awful lot of effort into their electric buses. Then this is actually a company in California that remanufactures buses. For a number of years, they would buy used buses from transits and then completely refurbish them and resell them back to the transits. It was a pretty cost-effective way to get coaches, and you would get them back depending upon how much refurbishment you wanted them to do. And they're now starting to venture into the electric bus, so they'll take what used to be a diesel bus, completely remanufacture everything and replace the drivetrain with an electric. And then Gillig is actually a company that has been around for over 100 years building buses for a variety of industry. When I first got introduced to buses was back when I was going to school. I drove school buses. And that was a Cadillac of school buses at the time, was a Gillig bus. That was back about 1970, I hate to say. But they kind of got out of the school bus industry and really concentrated on the public transits. And most of our large bus fleet that we have are Gilligs. They're a great manufacturer. They're built down in the Bay Area in California. And they're now just announced, just a couple months ago, that they're going to start producing battery electric buses. And they're teamed with one of the engine manufacturers, the diesel engine manufacturers, who are spending a lot of effort in diesel conversion to electric. And then there's Proterra. Proterra was they were the the little engine that could. I mean, they just really pushed our industry with innovation in really looking at what they needed to do to make a good electric bus. And essentially what they've done is they just cleared the paper, and they started with a fresh piece of paper, and they designed this bus to be an electric bus. The body is all composite, so relatively speaking, it's much lighter. It's very standardized. They looked at the airplane industry. Most of the buses are the same, but they're kind of custom. They have to get all the interior panels to line up and match, so they spend a lot of time with that, and they're not all the same. Whereas Proterra took things from the airline industry, and where they have joints on the interior panels, they have slip joints. So they just manufacture it, and it can slip, and there's a lot of leeway in their design. So you can buy a panel off the shelf, and it'll fit any of their buses. Well, I'm happy to say that this is actually the first of our electric buses, and I'm also happy to say that coming soon to a route near you, this is actually going to start in its construction in probably the middle of next month, and it's expected to be delivered probably around mid-January. So our first electric bus will be here in January. Now, this is one of the challenges that we have in our industry is the size of the vehicles. This is the largest coach, short of having those that bend in the middle. This is a 40-foot long coach, but having said that, it's the only one that we have, and my plan is for, probably the first year, this bus is going to be run on every one of our routes, whether it's a big bus need or a little bus, just so that we can get a good feel for how long will a charge last on this route. Because obviously one of the things that affects the range is topography, not to mention how many people are riding the bus. So this is our experiment bus. I'm also happy to say that the federal government has a number of different opportunities for funding for public transits, and they recently created a new opportunity. It's called low or no emission funding, and we have applied, and we were just notified a couple months ago of an award of $1 million, and we were the only transit system in the state of Washington that received the award. So we're pretty excited, and that's going to allow us to get the second bus. That's the one thing about these, they're not cheap. This particular coach, and some of the testing that they have to go through before we can spend federal dollars on the bus, they have to go through a testing facility. It's called the Altoona Testing Facility. When they did that, this bus got on average about the equivalent of 23 miles per gallon. That's huge. That bus in a diesel would probably get 5 miles to the gallon, downhill with a tailwind. So you can see how excited we are. And that's, I think, what's driving our industry now, is not only is it clean, but it's cheaper. You spend more money to get the bus in here, which the federal government helps us buy, but it's cheaper to operate, which the federal government doesn't help us at all. So it works great for us. If we can get these vehicles out there to run more efficient and cheaper, it's an advantage to the industry. That's why there's a lot of folks in our industry that are really starting to jump on the bandwagon with electric buses. And just to give you a quick idea, just in the state of Washington alone, Spokane Transit, which is probably the third largest in the state of Washington, they're acquiring 10 over that period, 19 to 21. Everett Transit, which is a very small city operation, they have 7 of the Proterra buses on order. They were a recipient of a low-no grant a few years ago. Pierce Transit, they have 3 on order from Proterra, and they're going to have 3 on order for 2018. King County Metro, they have 8 right now, And they have made the commitment that they're going to shift their entire fleet over to electric, whether it's the trolley with the overhead wire or battery. And really, to be honest with you, that's why I picked Proterra to go for, is King County already has 4 or 5 of the Proterra buses. Proterra is very, very interested, or I should say, they want to make sure that everybody's happy with their buses. I think Proterra is going to move a technician into the Puget Sound just so that if there is a problem, they can jump on it. Well, if we bought one bus, I probably wouldn't get that kind of response. But with King County and the rest of us around here with Proterra, if I have a problem with my bus, I'm sure I can call on that individual who's here in the Puget Sound. Now, I will say very quickly, too, with Proterra, one of the neat things is that, you know, how everybody thinks we're being, well, we probably are being followed with our smartphones. Proterra watches all of their buses, and all of their buses reports to Proterra what's going on with it. And Proterra oftentimes will call the transit agency and tell us of an upcoming problem before it becomes a problem because of the telemetrics that they're receiving in their coach, which I think is wonderful. Now we start talking about water. As was mentioned, it was pretty exciting for us that we're in the process of building a spare vessel, or building a vessel that will allow us to have a spare for our little ferry operation that we run between Bremerton and Port Orchard and Bremerton and Annapolis. And when we did the analysis or started looking at what kind of a boat did we want, we did an analysis on going hybrid versus just plain diesel. And we found, once again, financially, that it makes a lot of sense for us to go with a hybrid, not only because of the clean burning or reducing our impact to the environment, but the type of operation that we have. The boat motors across the inlet for 10 minutes. And then when they get to the dock, basically they throw a line over the cleat and they keep the motors running to hold it up against the dock while people get on and off. So those motors are running all the time. Well, in the scenario that we're going to be able to do with the hybrid is that when we're at the dock, instead of sitting there idling, or a little more than idling, it'll be purely electric that will be holding the boat against the dock. And then as we motor across the inlet, if necessary to recharge the batteries, the gen will come on and recharge the batteries. The other thing that's nice about it is basically when the diesel engine comes on, it comes on and runs at, you know, the optimum performance level for the diesel, so that it's, you know, polluting as little as we can while it's operating and recharging. So we're pretty excited about this, and you can see some of the savings that we're going to experience, or at least the reports that we did, the studies that we did suggest. So the other thing that was pretty nice is to be able to recover the added cost of developing the hybrid vessel. And in our estimation, we're going to be able to recover the cost in about 5.5 to 6 years, something like that. So at that point, we've recovered that extra cost, and then we just benefit from the savings that we're going to be experiencing for the rest of the life of that vessel. Now, I can only say I hope the rest of the life of that vessel is similar to the one that we currently have, which we just celebrated its 100th birthday here in September. So if we're able to keep this thing running for 100 years, we're going to be really in good shape. So I think with that, that's pretty much, and I'm assuming we're going to have questions later, so I'm going to stop at this point, and once again, thank you for the opportunity to come and share.
Thank you, John. So that's great. Well, our second speaker has arrived. Bill Moyer came all the way from Vashon Island, where he lives and where his nonprofit is. Last time Bill came to Bainbridge Island, he was organizing a kayaktivist thing at the fish farm here, and he brought a bunch of people, and they came by this great big inflatable he has, and kind of like Vikings. They descended on the shore, and launch that project. So this time I think you came by road, right? Ferry and road. So anyway, I think you'll find it very interesting, and so let's turn it over to Bill. Bill.
Thank you very much, Steve. Appreciate it. Good morning. Thanks for your flexibility. Tell you, they called the waters, I've been told that the coastal sailors used to now refer to the waters as those are the super highways. I'll tell you, it's not very fast coming that 13 or 14 miles we are, ferry after bridge, or et cetera. So when we landed on your shores a few months ago, it was as kayaktivists. And so that's how we actually got into this stuff. I'm not an expert in transit, and I'm not a railroad buff. You know, I didn't grow up that way. And but in the opposition to turning this region into a fossil fuel corridor to Asia, we were challenged by some railroad experts and labor to see if we could green a Northern Corridor modernization paper. The Northern Corridor is that rail corridor from Seattle to Chicago. And I've always found that in the 14 years of doing social change work, that our no, what we're opposing, our no, is only as powerful as our yes is compelling. Most healthy, normal people don't want to say no to something unless they know what the alternative is. And that's really understandable, and I really respect that. I actually think it's a lot better for us when we know what it is that we want instead. Whether we're locking down to the tracks, or whether we're out in a kayak, or whether we're just having a sensible conversation with our neighbors. So Mike Elliott, the guy who challenged me, he was with the Locomotive and Trainman Engineers Union. He said, why don't you see if your people can green this Northern Corridor paper? The thing that I love about railroads is they touch so many different people's interests and intersect so many different people's communities. And we can, Solutionary Rail, the reason we call it a people-powered campaign is because we think that the change really happens from the bottom up. And that it's that opportunity to create relationship between labor and farmers and rural communities and urban environment, folks impacted by diesel, et cetera, that actually gives us the power to build a positive populism that appeals to the best in people rather than the current negative populism that appeals to the worst in people. So the reason I've continued to stay on this project with such dedication is because it's so strategic. It's such a fascinating way to build power for a positive vision and not merely just oppose things. So after 3 years of work with railroad experts from around the country, we published the book Solutionary Rail. And I have brought a bunch of copies in hopes that you'll take some home for your holiday gifts. And I know that people probably only heard like 40% of the words in that video, so I'll do my best to run through some of this stuff. We inherited some of the ideas from the Steel Interstate Coalition. There's in the improvements that would need to happen to both speed up freight and draw freight traffic, cargo off of the roads, the trucks, and back onto the tracks, would mean that we'd have to get that average miles per hour, the speed up to be competitive with trucks. It has to be more regular, it has to be higher velocity, and it has to stop and serve more communities or restore service to communities. There needs to be grade separation. According to wherever there are bottlenecks, there'll need to be separation from the roads and the crossings. That's probably the most expensive part. Compared to Sound Transit, $2.5 million per mile doesn't actually sound that bad. That's what it costs, rule of thumb, to electrify double track. And that's one of the costs. Governor Inslee's, one of the reasons I wanted to come to this community is I know you're the home community of Governor Inslee. and Governor Inslee's support for a ultra high-speed rail idea from Seattle to Vancouver, BC is, I think, a boondoggle. They're talking about $125 million to $1 billion per mile for that. And that's something where they've already studied it. We've studied it since the 90s. That route, to be useful, has to stop in Bellingham and Everett. And to stop in Bellingham and Everett, the optimum speed is 110 miles an hour, not 250 miles an hour. So you don't have to reinvest in new corridor to put in a 250 mile an hour a train that's going to serve very few people. It's a much better investment to use the infrastructure and the rights of way that we already have. So how do we do it, and why aren't we already doing it? You saw an idea that came up in the middle of the video called the SETA, the Steel Interstate Development Authority. Why are we doing that? Why are we proposing that? Well, most of the world, their rail system is publicly owned. Ours is not. The way that the railroads, they pay taxes on their right-of-way. Just like with your house or your land, if you put a house on that land, it elevates the value, and it raises your taxes. So improvements on the right-of-way that's owned by the railroad company is going to elevate their taxes. That's a disincentive for them to make that investment. It's also going to take them a great deal of time to get the return on that investment, maybe 30 years. And as you know, that's not how private companies are operating these days. They're not thinking about that long term. They're often interested in that very short term. So the Steel Interstate Development Authority proposes here. I'll go through this a little bit. I don't want to get too caught up in all the details because we don't really have time for it, but very similar to the buses. Electric trains are easier to operate. They're more aerodynamic, and they're way more efficient than diesel electric trains, and they're just immeasurably more efficient than trucks. The rest of the world is doing this. These numbers are already outdated. Switzerland is 100% renewable energy, electrified rail, and and even this picture, they're putting the trucks onto the trains. Yeah, we are Ethiopia. We are behind Ethiopia. So why not in the U.S.? Like I said in the video, we say it's a fragmented ownership. They share track. They're very used to complex ownership relationships, so that's not really a problem as we introduce a new idea of the Steel Interstate Development Authority. Public's already subsidizing freight transport through the highways because the trucks aren't paying their fair share. The upfront capitalization costs, are significant but not daunting. So, this property taxes issue is a real issue for the railroad companies. All of it combined is keeping us from making progress. And things don't even get on, freight does not get on trains in the U.S. In certain corridors, it's a minimum of 300 miles. Other corridor, it might be 500 miles or 750 miles minimum. So if something's not going at least 750 miles, it doesn't get on the train, it gets on a truck instead. So the Steel Interstate Development Authority idea is the idea that the right-of-way, the electrification infrastructure be publicly financed, publicly owned, and publicly operated. When I say public, I mean a nonprofit, interjurisdictional authority that uses the tax-exempt status of a state or possibly tribes or some sort of combination of the two. And there would probably be multiple of these sort of entities, each one dealing with a particular freight corridor. The corridor that we've been working on because of the fossil fuel issues that we deal with in the Pacific Northwest is this Northern Transcon. Total, it's about 4,400 miles. It's all owned, except for a very small piece, by BNSF, which is owned by Berkshire Hathaway, and the principal of Berkshire Hathaway is Warren Buffett, the benevolent billionaire who really ought to be on board with this. We are not the most trafficked corridor for freight. There's more freight, tonnage of freight that travels on that southern corridor. That's also BNSF. This section right here. Ooh, look at this fancy light. And this is a jobs program. This is a way of shifting the infrastructure immediately. So they have trains in Europe that actually install these electrification systems, and they do 1 or 2 miles per day. And each car on the train has a different function. And this is not new to us. This is not the Jetsons. This is not this is not Tesla's Hyperloop. 1928, Washington State, we had 10 times more rail jobs. We had nearly every community was served. 15% of that rail was electrified. And we've been using regenerative braking going down the passes since 1915. I know, it's pathetic. Here, quick look, 759 miles of electrified rail in 1928 in Washington State. The Cascade Pass was electrified in 1909. City of Destiny, the place where the Milwaukee Road stopped, could be this. It's really powerful to be able to imagine what's possible, to have pictures, because of a lot of us think in that way. I think most of us. And so J. Craig Thorpe is the artist who did our renderings. So this is the idea that from the ships, the port can be electrified and put the cargo onto the electric intermodal trains. Won't get too stuck on this, but I just want to show how much of the value of freight is moving on the trains, on the rails right now. Only 3.5% of the value. I've only got 1 minute left. Okay, I'm going to zoom past this then. Highway damage, all these other reasons why we need to do this. And that the electric rail, that these high wind resources and solar resources in the country be tapped to, and we collaborate with rural electrical cooperatives to add new high voltage DC transmission, so that the variability of renewable energy is dealt with by spreading our supply across many weather patterns. The density of that computer-generated model for 80% renewable by 2035 is mirrored here in this passenger rail transport vision from National Association of Rail Passengers. So I want to go right. I want to relate it to trucks. There's lots of issues involved here from tribes, et cetera. But one of the big things I think that we're intersecting here today is the concept of the trucks. The way we are doing our rail currently, intermodal transport, because it has to go so far and it doesn't stop in those communities that used to be served, the trucks that pick up that freight have to travel a great distance back often. And that also concentrates the impacts of diesel onto communities like Kansas City and other places where the rail yards and the warehouse systems are causing 4,000 plus trucks per day, which are killing people in those communities. So what I've learned since we put out the book is how important that is we need to change the business model. We need to pull that freight over from the freeways. And we also need to serve communities again so that we can disperse the distribution and the impacts. And that will also allow us to electrify the trucks that bring that from the train to the market. Instead of having to travel 500 miles, they can travel 100 miles or 200 miles. And that's more doable with electric trucks than it currently is now. All right, so there's lots of intersecting issues here, and I hope you'll check out the book. And I hope we'll let Governor Inslee know that we'd really very much like for his Department of Transportation to be investing in feasibility study for solutionary rail. So I'm happy to answer further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Well, and sort of, I got so enthused about this program that I've added a lot to it. So here we go. We've got one more technical presentation, and then Randall Samstag is going to kind of wrap this up, and then we'll turn to questions. So let's go ahead next with Matt Von Rudden. Matt is Chief Engineer for the Washington State Ferries. He's been involved with a very exciting project about electrifying the ferries that serve Bainbridge Island. Matt has he's a graduate of the Coast Guard Academy. He worked on ferry transportation issues for many years. For how many years have you been with Washington State Ferries?
Just over 2, Steve.
Yeah, okay, just over 2. And he has a master's degree in naval architecture.
Naval architecture.
Yeah, so please welcome Matt Von Rudden.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today. When my first career was in the Coast Guard, and I first came to Bainbridge Island in 1998 as a tour of duty in Seattle for the Coast Guard, and got to riding the ferry every day to Seattle on my bike, and headed down to the Coast Guard base. And when I retired in 2009, after figuring out what to do, I moved up here and was pleased to come back to Bainbridge Island. And little did I know that I'd be working for the ferries and helping to support this great service. The Washington State Ferries is a key part of everybody who lives on Bainbridge Island. It's part of our lives, and but it's a bigger system than just Bainbridge. You may not know, as 24 million people we move every day in our routes that everywhere from Tacoma, south end of Vashon Island, all the way up to the San Juan Islands. So 24 million people. We have 22 vessels, and we're part of the State Department of Transportation. The State Department of Transportation is and has been and will be committed to environmental sustainability and healthy lifestyles and healthy communities. Here's some of our internal and external guidance we operate under in ferries. I won't read them to you, but it's real. We are committed, and when you talk and get to know the people who work in the Department of Transportation, we are indeed very committed. This is one of the key pieces of guidance that we're operating under right now, and this is our greenhouse gas reduction goals based on 2005 levels, and these are our targets. So the first one we're staring at here is July 1st of 2020 to try to get 15% reduction from our 2005 benchmark. And then we continue on there. We're not doing very well. It's difficult. We've made some progress, and here's some of the things we've done and how it's tracking here. And I'll cover some of the very specific things we've done in more detail here in the next couple slides. But as you can see, we're lower than we were in 2005, but we're not reducing at the rate that we should be. And you can see that ferry vessels are the major contributor to the Department of Transportation's carbon footprint. 1,000 gallons an hour of fuel is what's being burned with your ferry system right now. What have we done? What have we thought about doing? What are we working on now? Some of the initiatives we've had, propeller improvements. Pardon me. Propeller improvements. We've replaced propellers on a number of our vessels to more efficient propellers. In theory, we should have been able to get about 7 to 8% improvement by going from 4-bladed propellers to 5-bladed propellers with a slightly different pitch. We haven't fully realized that because things don't operate isolated. You have the operators who then operate the vessel slightly differently, and so far we haven't fully realized the benefit of propeller improvements. Biodiesel. In the past, we've explored biodiesel levels up to the level of 30% with some very bad results initially. Things have gotten better with biodiesel, and for the past several years, we've been running on 5% biodiesel with no problems. We're going to be looking at 10% biodiesel. Since February of this year, we've been operating the Tacoma, one of the vessels that serves Bainbridge Island, on 10% biodiesel as a pilot program, and that seems to be going very well. We did want to do it for a full year to make sure we experienced all the temperature fluctuations throughout the year. And that's going well. So in February, we'll make the call whether to proceed with 10% biodiesel for the rest of the fleet. Speed reductions, we did execute speed reductions. That's one of the best ways to save fuel on any kind of ship, is to slow down. If you're operating, you know, at 95% of your power, you're pushing a lot of water, a lot of wave making resistance, and you're going to burn a lot of fuel. Slowing down helps. We've done that on Edmonds Kingston. We're going to look at it where else we can do that. Some things we considered and didn't pursue, or have not pursued yet anyway. We looked at converting 6 of our Issaquah class ferries to liquefied natural gas. Those vessels are past their midlife, so they're very, you know, the return on investment opportunity is limited, and there wasn't funding available for this. To convert the 6 vessels, I think, was like $86 million, and there just wasn't funding available. And the price differential, as you know, between LNG and diesel was much greater than it is now, so the benefit isn't as great. Some years back, we looked at converting the Hayak, one of our 50-year-old super class ferries, to diesel electric. We looked at it because we'd been so far behind in our upgrades. We thought, well, we could catch up with this vessel, but we looked at that. The cost of such an old vessel, they start looking at everything that needs to be replaced and how much life you have left in it. It just didn't pencil out for the Hayak. But we learned a lot, and that's going to reap benefits going forward. Operational efficiencies. You know, you take a ferry and you take a crew and you take a schedule, and that's kind of what makes up service. And some of our schedules are really untenable. They actually require us to operate our vessels at pretty much full speed to make our own schedule, and that's not very efficient. It also creates all kinds of stress when you're trying to turn the vessel around, get cars and people off and get them back on. So a lot of things we can do just with our schedules to save fuel. How we load the vessels. If we load them evenly and have even trim, we're going to get generally better fuel efficiency than if we load everything up front and have uneven trim. Some examples of what we're looking at there. But looking forward is what's really exciting. Vessel restraint systems. If you walk off the ferry, you can see the churn of the propeller as we push the dock. 40% of our time is spent pushing the dock, and we're burning fuel while we're doing that. We're looking at, there are technologies out there to actually hold the vessel in place, so you don't need to do that. That's a great opportunity for us. New vessel design. The current vessels we're building, we're delivering the 4th Olympic class vessel here in July. We're receiving it from our shipyard, Vigor. And but those vessels are not, they're conventional diesel with reduction gears and controllable pitch propellers, and they're not a hybrid. That's because this project started back really in 1999-2000 time frame, and we just weren't there. The technology wasn't there yet. So the next design of vessels surely will consider such technologies. So what can we do in the shorter term? And that's what mainly I want to talk about today, is electrification of our existing fleet. So this is made visually, not that you need to read all the words, but what's going on in the maritime industry with electrification. It's been going on since the early 2000s. 2006 is really when it started going, and it just keeps accelerating. We've got some projects here on our own backyard with Foss and so forth, but really where this is happening is in Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden. They've been doing a lot of work with electrification of their fleet, and some of the more interesting ones to read about, if you read about Vision of the Fjords and the Ampere, these all-electric ferries, and they're smaller than what we're operating for Washington State Ferries, but they're great models right now for people like It's a Transit who are getting ready to build smaller ferry boats. But there's some big conversions here too. So really, what's becoming more and more clear is this is not rocket science anymore. These things are available, and you know, you go to trade shows. I don't intend for you to read this, but you know, you go to trade shows. There's 5 maritime companies that are producing batteries for the maritime sector. There's people developing systems, for converting hybrid from the shore charging to the batteries themselves, power management systems. There's competition out there. Things just keep getting better and better. Here's a product that's not in production yet, but we're still a charging station here for the Ampere. So this is no longer rocket science. This is a real opportunity that we can pursue. So why now and why this vessel? A couple things. These vessels, we have 3 vessels of the Jumbo Mark II class. They're approaching their 20th birthday. And believe it or not, a lot of the propulsion controls are obsolete. We're literally buying parts on eBay. We have great service because it's a great vessel design. It's got so much redundancy, and Stan contributed to that.
Designed it, right.
That your ferry service. I enjoy being a commuter in Bainbridge and just incognito, just listening to comments, and it's the wonderful thing when people take ferry service for granted. And 99.5 or better reliability, that's just great. And of course, occasionally we have a disruption and I get to hear other things, but these are very reliable vessels, but we're working with the propulsion system provider Siemens on identifying all the technologies that need to be upgraded to keep these vessels operating for their targeted life of 60 years. So we've got 40 years left in these vessels, so they're a good target. The other thing about them, they're our largest fuel consumer. These 3 vessels burn 26% of that total fuel for the ferry system. They're iconic. They are our largest vessels. They're just, but fundamentally, they have the architecture that could support conversion. They're AC, alternating current, diesel electric propulsion. So there's technologies out there that can make this not too significant of a project. So what could we save? 5 million gallons a year of fuel, just with this one project. Almost 57,000 tons of CO2 and the associated reduction in NOx and particulates. And $14 million in our operating funds that we could possibly use for something else. So really attractive project. So when you take the architecture of the vessel, the hydroelectric source of some electricity in the Pacific Northwest, and then really the rapid advancement of a couple of the areas in the technology. One is the batteries keep getting cheaper. They keep getting more dense. They keep, there's more and more competition. You take that and then the rapid charging capability. It now, when I first came to this job and what I knew about it was, yeah, we could do it, but we couldn't make it all the way across the sound, and we couldn't really charge the vessels in the amount of time we had. Both those assumptions have proven to be false now. There's technology that allows you to charge a vessel in 15 minutes and get it back on its way, and it can make all the way across the sound. So we wanted to look at this further. A gentleman, Elliott Bay Design Group, Will Ayers wrote a paper that talked about, in general, he's a former Ferry's employee, talked about these factors and what it could mean for Washington State ferries in the Pacific Northwest. We followed up with that with commissioning a feasibility study. And we took an incremental approach for several reasons. You know, how much money would we have? What would be the progressive increase in savings here? And what this was is, here's our baseline. On these vessels, they have 4 generators, and we operate 3 of them at any given time. We really only need to operate 2 from a power perspective, but from a reliability and safety perspective, we operate 3. So that means they're not loaded properly. So that's poor fuel economy. It's bad for the engines. And that's something we need to address. So we looked at what are the 4 options for addressing this. One is just adding some a small amount of battery with a power reserve that would allow us to just operate 2 engines and use that battery as a spinning reserve as a safety, so that we don't have to stress about, coming into the dock and losing an engine and having a hard landing elision. So just that, allowing those 2 engines to operate at their optimal speed would be better. Whoops, I'm going to get cut on short on time here. So the other 2 are if we installed larger batteries. The third increment is if we had one charging on one of the terminals, and the fourth is if we had charging stations on both terminals. And you can see the relative increase. So basically, here's the very simplified one line about the propulsion system. You have 4 diesel generators. The idea here is to just replace 2 of them with batteries and a converter, and that's basically how it would happen. This is an example. This is our current operating on 3 engines over the route, and how low power it is and how inefficient. Here's the battery charging of charge and discharge that allows you to operate your engines efficiently. Running out of time, so I won't tell you where all the pieces were going to go. That's what I was going to do here. Right now, what are we doing? We're doing infrastructure. We're doing preliminary design studies to look at the vessel, to look at getting the electricity to the terminal and getting the electricity from the terminal to the vessel. We're doing one of them ourselves with the utilities, Snohomish PUD, Puget Sound Energy, and Seattle City Light. Then we have Gloston looking at the ship-shore interface, and Elliott Bay Design Group looking at the vessels. Next steps and a potential timeline. If we were to get funding, you could see that we could get this up and running on the Bainbridge route as early as 2021, and in the following year in the Kingston-Edmonds route if there were funding available. Funding, a couple sources out there. There's the Volkswagen settlement funds are a great fit for this. There are bonds. So there's a couple funding options that the Office of Financial Management is working with us to identify. Cost, early on, there's just so many unknowns. The number is quite large. As you start really getting a better idea what the design looks like, those cost numbers will come down. We're getting a better idea what this will cost. Technical risks are really very small. You do have issues with the potential for lithium-ion battery thermal runaways. The Coast Guard's concerned about that. The interface is probably not as mature. The charging robot or inductive charging system that you would need. And then the one big problem for us is vessel availability. We'd have to take one of the Bainbridge vessels out for almost 6 months to get this done. We don't have a lot of spare vessels, so just finding time to get the work done while maintaining your service. And I'm glad to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Matt. Well, we're getting close. This program runs a little long. I think when we get to questions, if some of you have to leave, I think maybe you can kind of quietly exit and so on. But we have wrapping up this program. We've got Randall Samstag. Many of you know Randall. He lives on the islands, lived on the island a long time, and has been a member of the Utility Advisory Committee. Randall has a bachelor's degree in political science from Stanford University. He has a master's degree in engineering, civil engineering from the University of California, Berkeley. He's done a lot of work, and his main field is sewer engineering and that kind of thing. And in fact, he spent a couple of years at least in Mexico helping with sanitation and on a voluntary basis and so on in Chiapas and stuff. Has some interesting stories there. He drives an electric car. So here's Randall to help wrap this program up.
Thanks, Steve. So we've heard about trains, buses, and ferries. We heard 3 one-hour presentations, and all delivered in 1 hour total. Steve told us that about half of the carbon pollution in the transportation sector comes from personal vehicles. So what about them? So this is a projection of electric vehicle sales in the United States from Bloomberg from 2000 up to 2010 up to 2025. They say it's going up, but it's only getting to like 15% of total car sales combined, plug-in hybrid and total electric. Can we do better than that? I think we can and we need to do better, and if we're actually going to curb carbon pollution. So I did a little calculation. What would it take to convert all of the cars that run, personal vehicles that run in the state of Washington to electric vehicles? How much power would that require? And the main point is the number that with the red circle around it, 1,600 megawatts. That sounds like a lot of power, but compared to the 10,000 megawatts of power that we consume every year in the state, it's less than 20%. So it's a significant amount, but it's actually only less than a fifth of the total amount of power that we consume. So it's doable to convert all of those cars to electric vehicles. Well, the electricity sector produces carbon pollution itself, and it produces just about the same amount of carbon pollution as the automobile sector, around 20 million tons of carbon every year. 3/4 of it's coming from 3 for-profit electric utilities, PSE, PacifiCorp, and Vista. PSE contributes about half of the carbon pollution in the state for electricity. Well, if we converted all the cars to electric vehicles, what would be the result? Well, I did some calculations using sources from the state and my own calculations, and my conclusion is that we could cut the carbon pollution in the state by about a half, even if the cars were powered from PSE's dirty fuel source, 60% carbon pollution. Of course, if we power it from BPA's fuel source, we could eliminate that 20 million tons almost entirely. How could that possibly be? And I think this is a slide that kind of applies to all the talks you've heard this morning. It's the efficiency, stupid. An internal combustion engine is about 25% efficient. That means that of that, every unit of energy that goes into that internal combustion engine, 75% of it is going off as carbon dioxide and heat. Don't forget the heat. Whereas an electric motor is about 95% efficient. So this is the kernel of importance. This is the important fact about why electrification of transportation is so important. It's the efficiency of an electric motor compared to an internal combustion engine. So, heat and carbon dioxide is not the only thing that comes out of the tailpipe of an internal combustion engine. We get particulate matter, unburned hydrocarbons, nitrous oxides, and all of the rest of those things that are not good things for humans and children and animals. It's a massive pollutant source, and we could eliminate that pollutant source substantially if we were powering this with our cars with electric power. So the question is, what can an individual here on Bainbridge Island do to combat climate change? Well, the first thing is to get out of your infernal combustion-driven car. Walk, ride a bike, take a bus, take a train, take a ferry. Get out of that infernal combustion engine. It's a polluter, and it is burning up our climate. And it turns out converting to an EV can be done without an unprecedented change in our electricity supply. And of course, if we convert it with and charge that car with renewable energy, we can get rid of almost the entire pollution from that sector. So we've gone over time. I think Steve's going to manage questions for all the speakers, and I'll turn it back to him.
Okay. Thank you, Randall.
My question is for Kitsap Transit. I was interested in the conversion of existing buses and wonder if that's completely off of the table. And the reason I ask is because it seems inefficient to get rid of good buses if they can be converted.
Okay, so good question, and right here.
For the Washington State Ferries, why convert the Mark IIs? They're way heavier than the jumbos, and the electric won't work as well. You need to follow the model of Proterra. Take a white sheet of paper, build your boat like Ampere, and improve the system.
Okay, let's go ahead. John, take that first question.
Well, in regards to retrofitting buses, buses themselves have a limited life, kind of like the ferry boats, and then you can refurbish them, but you don't necessarily get, you double the life of a vehicle. In the conversion from a diesel to an electric, to be perfectly honest with you, I'm not sure what the cost is to do that. Complete Coach Works, which is the only one that I'm aware of that would do that, they basically will just tell you how much it is to buy their bus, not convert one of our buses. So it's a bit more of a challenge to do that kind of conversion.
Okay, so for the ferry question was why convert the Jumbo Mark IIs? Why not convert the Jumbo Mark Is? Jumbo Mark IIs, there's only 2 vessels and they're near the end of their life, so there's no payback period. It's simple as that. Jumbo Mark IIs are only 20 years old. They're our biggest fuel consumer. We have 3 of them, and it's a fairly simple technological solution. So as I said in my presentation, new construction is also the key, but to start a new construction program sounds like you have a background. You know that 7 or 8 years to get from blank sheet of paper to delivering a new vessel in the fleet. We don't have funding for a new vessel construction program right now, so this is the biggest impact we can make in the shortest period of time.
Okay, back here and then right there.
Hi, for Kitsap Transit. When I started commuting on the island back around 2004 from South Bainbridge, it seemed like there were a lot of smaller buses that were kind of more right-sized. And now we see them, and I see that Proterra looks like a really large bus. And so I wonder what the change has been to the larger carriers, or to the larger coaches, and is one of the options to go to smaller size buses. And I just want to say one other thing, which is I absolutely, as somebody who now works at home, I love BI Ride. BI Ride is a fantastic service, so thank you very much for that. And again, a lot of times you're running a huge bus that could carry 40 people and you got 2 people on it, so is there an option to kind of right-size those as well?
I think right, this woman right here, I think was number 2.
Yeah, I was interested to hear how the faster the ferries go, the more inefficient they are, and thinking about all the excitement around the high-speed ferries that are going to be coming in Kingston and that are already in Bremerton, and how much those are undercutting our efforts to try to, reverse the pollution in the ferries that you're talking about, or is it because there's so little it's not going to matter much?
Well, I can try to respond to both, and maybe you want to add some things to it. But as far as the right sizing of vehicles, what we refer to as cutaways, which is essentially a bus body on the back of a truck frame, which are the smaller of the vehicles that we currently own, their life is very short. They're like a 5, maybe 7-year bus before we have to replace them. They just don't hold up. Our fleet size is probably the most varied in any transit system, certainly in the state, and I hear about it all the time from the Federal Transit Administration because we have too many spares because of our different sizes. But when you get into what's classified as a heavy duty bus that has a life expectancy more like 15 years, the shortest that we can get right now is 30 feet. Most of our new buses that we've recently purchased are 30-footers. Unfortunately, in the electric bus industry right now, most of their efforts have been concentrating in the big buses. There are, in fact, Proterra just announced that they're going to be building a 35-foot, which is the majority of our big bus fleet is in that 35-foot category. So the next one that we'll be buying is probably going to be the 35. GILEC has been experimenting with a 30-foot electric bus, and that's what we're really hoping for, because when we go to replace these buses that we just purchased, I certainly want to be going electric in the small buses because it makes just a whole lot more sense. As far as the fast ferries, in regards to the fast ferries that we're involved with, that's going to be starting in Kingston next summer, it is absolutely correct. When you do speed, you're pushing a lot more water. We have mitigated that somewhat with the vessels that we operate between Bremerton and Seattle, primarily because of the wake is what drove it. It's, relatively speaking, very light. Everything from the main deck up is all composite. We have a wing that is between the two hulls of a catamaran that, it's not a hydrofoil, it doesn't come up on skis, but that wing does help lift a lot of the vessel so that there's only about 12 to 14 inches of the hull in the water when we get to speed. And that helps an awful lot with not having, relatively speaking, the need for as much power. But we do burn a lot. Not like WSF, but one round trip from Bremerton to Seattle and back, we burn about 120 gallons of fuel.
Yeah, just in that operational efficiency discussion that I was alluding to there are a couple factors. For any given vessel, particularly a conventional displacement vessel, it's an exponential curve. So as you get higher and higher down up to speed, additional speed takes an increasing amount of fuel. And then the other part about operational efficiency is making sure that the vessel is loaded near capacity. You know, that's the great thing about the small passenger-only vessels, is that you're only hauling what you need to haul, as opposed to that, 1 in the morning run from Edmonds to Kingston may have 20 cars on it and 4 people, and you're taking this large vessel across the water. So those are the type of things that, they don't take a whole lot of technology, just maybe looking at the schedules and vessel utilization, you can still save a lot of fuel.
A couple of things that I would add too, in the operational scenario that Matt mentioned earlier was absolutely right on. With our route that we run from Bremerton to Seattle, we basically run high speed, pedal to the metal, and that's because of the low wake. Ironically, the faster that boat goes, the better the wake profile is. Once we come out of Rich Passage, though, the boat slows down into economy mode so that we're not draining an oil well somewhere in Saudi Arabia. So that's really what we intend to do. But the other thing is that, and Matt's right on, the way we do it in the transit world, and it's primarily because of vehicle size, when one of our routes reaches capacity for that vehicle, we add a second vehicle. But that demand is relatively short period of time. So our expectation, for example, with Bremerton, we're buying 2 additional boats. One of those 2 additional boats would be so that during the peak period, we could put the second boat on to deal with the demand. But as soon as we get out of the peak and the demand isn't there, we pull that boat out of service, and we're only running one more appropriate to the demand at that period of the day.
Question for Kitsap Transit. Why did you choose a hybrid passenger ferry for your Port Orchard and Annapolis route? Reason I ask is the route is a similar length to the Ampere in Norway, where they have an all-electric ferry, and it should be short enough to charge on both sides. What led to choosing a hybrid ferry instead of all electric?
Our current operation between Port Orchard and Bremerton, we own 2 of the vessels, and we have a peak need of 2 vessels. We don't have a spare. So we were building spare into that system, and we don't have 7 years to design something and get it approved by the Coast Guard and so on. Hybrid was enough of a challenge to get approved, but the technology that we're putting on the boats themselves, to be perfectly honest with you, is the same technology that is running around in hybrid buses, BAE system. So it was something that we could get in and get quick, because we need that spare. The only spare we have is one that the private contractor that's operating our service for us has. And most of our boats are in the 120 to 150 passenger range, and their spare is 30.
All right, so great question. One of the things that I love about the railroad stuff is that it's not a huge leap forward. As I mentioned, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is 100-year-old technology. That said, what's really the shift is the business model for railroads. It's for them to be moving faster, more regular service, and stopping it in more communities. To shift a business model of a railroad industry, just like any other, they and the transmission industry might be some of the hardest folks to try to shift how they do business. And so one thing I'm sort of counting on, or I think that people who care about electrification are counting on, is there's an element of inevitability about this. The rest of the world is going in that direction. Coal, despite current policies, is not really coming back. The need for the shift of the business model is probably going to happen. But when it happens, it shouldn't be like 1970 when the federal government bailed out the railroad companies, because they're a regulated monopoly. They're a common carrier. They had an obligation to fulfill passenger service to every community, and they couldn't operate their business and do that as successfully. So the federal government took away that obligation and created Amtrak. Amtrak was a bailout of the private railroad industry. If we get to a situation where their business model is no longer functioning, and that's the trajectory we're on, we want to make sure that transition happens with the stakeholders highly educated about what their interests are and how their interests relate to other stakeholder interests, so that we can go into that inevitable change that I believe is in front of us, and with strong negotiating power and in coalition with other folks who we wouldn't normally think of as our allies. And next steps are really to do the feasibility study on corridor to corridor level, to figure out, do the cost benefit analysis to see how you get that most efficiently get the average speed up, so that then we can start redirecting the emphasis of recentering rail in our both freight and passenger transport models.
Okay, with that, we got to end this with a challenge. 2 lessons I saw in this: go out and get an electric car, and support policies that get us off coal and natural gas to provide the fuel for these cars. It ought to be clean and renewable, not dirty fuel. So with that, Randall, do you have anything to add? You didn't get a chance to ask her a question here? Okay, and Laura, I think you're going to make some closing remarks.
There are actually some actions we want to encourage people to take. We like to create an educated stakeholder base. I love that terminology, because we're trying to move action forward. So there's some very near-term actions you can take. There are 2 groups who are very interested in moving forward, especially non-motorized transit options for Bainbridge Island, and those are the Climate Action Bainbridge and Sustainable Bainbridge's Go Bainbridge program. There is a planned meeting for December 14th in the Sterling Building at 7 p.m. to talk about a strategy on all of these issues. And where did Erica go? If you want to talk to someone about that immediately, please talk to Ms. Erica Schreiner in the back of the room. An additional thing, a little plug I'll do for Sustainable Bainbridge, because I dressed for it today. The next Trashin' Show has already been planned for March. This is my mother's entry made of my socks. So get working on yours. They're due March 15th. The second is that embracing electrification. Personally, if you get a car, go electric. Quick survey. How many of you walked here today? Raise your hand, please. You are my favorite people. How many of you rode your bikes here today? You are my second favorite people, and my son, so that's a winner there. How many people drove an electric car here today? Okay, I'm shaming the rest of you. Hybrid, okay, you get 50% credit, partial credit, good job. Okay, advocate for what I like to refer to again as electronification. Anywhere we can move into using electrons that are generated cleanly as our power source, ideally doing them with as much conservation as possible. And then regionally, let's campaign for carbon-free power for all of Washington. We have a great head start on everyone, but why don't we try and make it the whole deal? And we currently have elected officials who are down with that idea, so let's take advantage of that. We have a moment in time, and as we see, that can change. So thank you again to the Eagle Harbor Congregational Church. Please make a donation to support our continued use of this space. They were floored and impressed by the generosity of last month. We will be having competing months. The organizing committee, which is Friends of Island Power, Climate Action Bainbridge, Sustainable Bainbridge, Climate Citizens Lobby, and EcoAdapt. There's information about all these groups out in the lobby. Please help yourself to those items on the way. And several of these groups are local 501c3s who could use your support to continue their work. Thanks to Jane Lindley and Charles Thatcher for having us have a website, BainbridgeIslandForum.org. Lots of information available there. Charles also spearheads getting all of this videotaped, so the videotape versions of these presentations will all be available on that website. Thank you to all of the speakers for traveling from near and far to present to us today. They will all be available after the show for comments, signatures, autographs, whatever. And thank you to all of you for wanting to be part of that informed stakeholder cohort. We need you to move forward. Next month, or not next month, you get next month off for good behavior. January 17th at 7 p.m. It will be dark, it will be winter, it will get you out with your community. We'll be having a session on climate justice. It is a great group of speakers. I have worked with all of these organizations on various things. Some of them are even organizations right here on Bainbridge Island. And the climate justice issue is a really important one, both nationally and internationally. And it's a big issue in our region. So if you do not know anything about climate justice, come and learn more. If you already know a lot, come and share what it is you know. And then coming up in February, we'll be talking about carbon fee and dividend, probably one of the most widely supported solutions to this problem, and the development of something that's really applicable across the United States. So thank you for all coming, and see you next month or January sometime. Bye.